that happen. We are continuing on in a series in Romans right now because the book of Romans is a powerful, powerful letter that is written to the church in Rome. But it's such a good letter because Paul, when he writes it, says, you know what, we gotta know what it is we believe. And so he spends the first 11 chapters of the book talking about what it is we believe, because we got to think right if we're going to do the right thing. And see, this is a beautiful thing because he spends those 11 chapters, we've been kind of dialoguing through it. He's been setting, like, what is the gospel message? What is it we're all about? And then he says, why do we desperately need that message? And then he gets into how grace comes in and fills us with this faith that grows and moves us forward in this dynamic, transformational relationship with a God who loves us. And then we get to chapter 12. And in chapter 12, there's a change that happens in the book of Romans. And all of a sudden he says, you know what? Here is what it's been all about. And this is the theology. This is good theology. And some of you sit there and go, I don't know about theology. I just know that I want to be close to Jesus. And if there's an opportunity to go to heaven, then I want that. But each one of us has some kind of theology. And Paul says it's important to get that theology, because what theology is, it's a study of God. It's a study of what we think about God. And Paul says you got to know what it is you know. You got to think right in order to really move forward in this journey. That's why he spends 11 chapters talking about it. But sometimes we get to that point and we're like, okay, now this is what I think, this is what I believe, but how does that translate into real life? Because we're like, yeah, that's important, but my life is just different. You know, and a lot of times I've heard people make excuses. They're like, but I live in a world that's radically different than when the Bible was written. And so, I mean, come on, we got cell phones, we got all this stuff. I mean, how does this really connect? And Paul says there's something that needs to go that translates what we think, what we know about God, into how it is that we live. Does this work in real life? Some of you might have been asking that question at some point in your journey. How does this work in real life? Because I see some people, they're all about Jesus and stuff like this, but it just doesn't seem like it really makes a tangible connection to my life. But here's the thing that Paul starts when he writes Romans 12. He basically throws it out from the beginning. He says, following God takes a total commitment. Living for God is not about what I choose to do on Sunday morning. It's not even what I choose to do occasionally if I've got a reading plan or a prayer routine, or before meals I pray and stuff like this. Those are the moments I infuse God. He says if you're going to be about God, you got to be all in. You got to be fully invested in this. There is a total commitment to this process. And in this total commitment, this means a absolutely surrendered life. See, why do we surrender? See, a lot of times we surrender to things all the time. Things that are not that valuable. We surrender, it really, let's look at it. I mean, I already mentioned cell phones and stuff like this. If we get a buzz, some of you are already struggling right now because you've been, your phone's in your pocket and it just buzzed just a second ago and you're like, oh, I got to check that. I got to check it, because we are surrendered to the control of our phones, that control of the contact. We're surrendered to this. Ultimately, he's saying, you know what? You got to surrender to the God that has written this gospel message for you. This one that is drawing you into this relationship with you. You got to surrender completely to him all the time. This is what it says in Romans 12, verse 1. He says, therefore, because of all the stuff you know, because of the good theology that I've invested in your head at this point, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, because you see the way God responds to you, the fact that he loves you deeply. This is the good theology that we need to have. It's not about being scared of this cosmic God, this cosmic police officer that's looking to make sure he can bust us whenever we do something wrong. But because he loves you, in view of his mercy, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. I mean, that is a weird statement in this world today, because we sit there and look at it and go, well, offer my body as a living sacrifice. Okay, God, I'll give it to you. But see, the sacrificial system in the Old Testament was such that they had these things that were like, they would call it basically a burnt offering. And it was when you would take something and you would put it on the altar and you would let it be completely consumed, and the fragrance would go up to God as if it was just being completely offered to him. And he says right here, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. You're not going to be physically consumed like a burnt offering, but really, you are for one purpose. At that point, he's saying all of your choices, all of your hopes, all of your goals in life, all of your interactions with other people, all of that has to center around God. See, when we talk about something like that, we're like, is that really what this is about? Because I wanted to give a little bit. I'll give him about 50%. Can I give him 51%? That's like a majority. I'll give him 51% as long. And he says, no, you're either all in or it doesn't work. See, people all the time sit there and say, well, I think that there's some kind of truth to following after Jesus and to living for Jesus and stuff, but I just can't make it work, because it doesn't work if you're in one and out one. If you're halfway in and halfway out, you're fully surrendered. He says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Man, we made worship into be anything but what really is biblical today. Because people look and go, oh man, I want to go to a place where they got good worship. You mean music? Is that what we're talking about right now? Now, I'm saying music is awesome and it's important, and I love what Pastor Ray does, and but it's not worship. Worship is me being absolutely committed to God when no music is happening, when no church people are around. It's absolutely committed to God when I'm in a difficult situation and I'm saying, you know what, I can choose to go a different direction, but I'm going to press in because I believe God wants me in this moment, in this time. And see, that's worship. He says this is what you have to do. You have to be 100% committed to that process. 100% committed to God, or else it's not really what it's intended to be. This theology, this good truth that you have, isn't making a translation into your life. It is a surrendered life. And the second thing that we see in what it means to be totally committed, not just a surrendered life, but a transformed mind. Because some of the biggest challenges is not what we choose to do on the regular. A lot of times it's happening what's in that gray matter between our ears. And we need to be transformed, because the reality is we are conditioned to live a certain way. And you can say, I'm not conditioned for anything. Yes, you are. As we're raised, we're conditioned for certain things, for certain expectations, for the way to perceive life. We're conditioned on how to accept that. And this is what he says, in Romans 12, verse 2. Do not conform to the pattern of this world. He says you have been conformed and you are conforming. And when new technology comes out, we conform to that. When new ways of thinking is, we conform to that. And we wonder why it is that we're so distracted and confused from the things of God. He says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That our mind has to completely change. It doesn't say start thinking a little bit differently. It says be transformed by the renewing. It means take away all of that stuff, that mode of thinking, that way of processing, the way that you interact with people. Take that out and put in a new system for your life. I mean, we hate it. My tablet did it just this morning, and I know my tech guy would be like, you did not do that, did you? But my tablet, this morning says, it's time for an update. Do you want to do it, or do you want to cancel it? And I said, sure, do the update. But we've all been in that situation when it goes through the update and things are totally different. That's why tech guys will say, do not update right before you're about to go on stage and talk. That is a dumb idea. But I did it believing in the power of Jesus. No, I just did it because I'm that dumb. But see, the thing is, there is sometimes the update changes so much that it's radically different. And our mind needs such an update, such a transformation, that it's going to perceive things. You're like, well, wait a second. Before, I've always done it this way, and now I'm starting to do it this way. Because we need that renewal of our mind. But be renewed in your mind. And it says, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. When he says that, he's not saying that you're actually going to be able to test it. Like, God, you need to run your ideas through me, and I'll tell you whether that's going to be good. We're not giving approval. We're actually approving the fact that God is doing something, and all of a sudden my mind actually fits with his system. And all of a sudden it goes, actually, this works. See, the problem is our faith doesn't work because we're not fully vested. And I hate to speak a hard truth, but this is the truth that Paul speaks. He says it's not working in your life because you're not fully committed to it. You're not fully sold out, body and mind. You need to be in his will, his design, accept his plans for your life. Because really, what is life? We need to think about that. Life is not just a sense of, well, I woke up today and I breathed. And I breathe and I'm like, I guess I have some choices. Life is a compilation of choices, behaviors, and actions based on your perspective. It is all the things you've chosen to do. And many of us, we've already made like hundreds of choices today. Hundreds of choices. And so this is actually what gives us life. It's not the fact that we breathe, it's the fact that I'm making choices, I'm engaging in behaviors, I'm choosing to do actions, but they're always predicated on the way that I perceive things. But is our perception right? Because if our perception is wrong, wait a second, that means my choices, my behaviors, my actions might be wrong. That's why he says you have to be fully invested, fully committed, or else you're going to be constantly struggling in this tug of war. Your soul's going to be like, man, I want to do the things of God, but I can't do the things of God. I'm struggling because I'm not continuing to lay myself down. See, the sacrifice is not a one-moment thing. It's a daily thing for me. Because I realize how quickly I can get skewed on the other ways of thinking. Because if we're going to have the right perspective, see, Romans 12, he sits there and says, okay, 1 and 2, he says, you got to be all in. Body and mind. You got to be all in the things of God. And he says, this is how it's going to work. And then he says, now here I want to impact your perspective. And the ways that we need to think about our perspective is this. We need to see how we view ourselves. We need to see how we view ourselves, and really we view ourselves with humility, he says. He says if you're going to really live out the cause of Christ, if you're going to live for the things of God, you've got to be more humble. And some of you are like, well, I'm super humble. That right there shows you're not humble. I mean, we naturally think, well, I got a good perspective of who I am. But this is where I want to challenge what we're thinking. And I think Paul wants to challenge what we're thinking because we've been conditioned to think of ourselves first. I mean, think of it. All of our senses, and you're like, well, God created me with my senses, but all of our senses are gauged by me. It's what I hear, it's what I feel, it's what, it's how I engage these things. And therefore, I get to choose the way that I'm going to perceive it. This is what it says in Romans 12:3. He says, for by the grace given me, I say to every one of you. I like the way that Paul starts out a talk on humility by not saying, by the way, I'm a really smart guy. This is why I'm writing the book. He is the best theologian in the new, maybe ever, but definitely in the first century. And he doesn't say, look, I'm smarter than you guys. I figured this out. God has spoken to me. But he says, it's by the grace given me. He says, I'm not all that. He says, but God is moving in me. And because God's moving in me, I want to tell you something. He says, by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought. but rather think of yourselves with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. He's saying, you know what? We have a mind problem. We think of ourselves as a little bit more important than what we actually are. And see, a lot of times I'm not, because some of you are like, well, I struggle with low self-esteem. I don't have a problem with that. But here's the thing, that it maybe sometimes is not thinking as highly, but as highly is with. How much do you think of yourself? That's a little too much. Because a lot of us, we spend way too much time thinking of how people are going to perceive us in every situation that we find ourselves in. Some of you, I'm not trying to call you out or whatever, I'm just trying to speak the truth. Some of you spent way too much time today thinking about what you would wear because you're worried about what people are going to think of you. I'm not saying just go sloppy and be awful, but come on, let's think about it a little bit. People aren't, I have to process this sometimes when we think about this, because my son has gone through a season, where he's really aware that other people are seeing. And I'm like, bro, people aren't looking at you nearly that much. They're not looking at you nearly as much as you think they're looking at you. But we think of ourselves more highly than we are. We're like, no, people really are watching me. I'm pretty cool. Or even if you don't think you're that cool, you're spending way too much time thinking of how to fix how uncool you are. Because we think of ourselves way too much. Here's the thing that I want us to understand. You are not the center of the universe. Just because your senses are telling you this is how to perceive it doesn't mean that it's all about you. And this is something, I'm not into self-help and all this. We say this all the time. But I do think sometimes we need to maybe look in the mirror. Not tell ourselves how good we are, but sometimes we need to tell ourselves in the mirror, it's not all about you. And then we're like, okay, now I'm ready to maybe go about my day. Maybe I'm ready to go about my business. And so Paul sits there and says, you know what? You got to be 100% invested. You got to change your mind, and you got to see yourself well, because your life is predicated on the choices you make based on your perceptions. And if your perception is all about you, you've already lost. You've already missed the boat, because it's not about you. But he also is saying, he doesn't want you to think less of yourself. He doesn't want to think you're a loser. That's not the point. Don't go tell yourself you're a loser and ineffective and never going to accomplish anything, because God has a role and a purpose for you. In Romans 6 to 12, it says, we have different gifts according to the grace given each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy according to your faith. If it is serving, then serve. If it is teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. He says you have gifts. You have abilities. You have something to offer, but it fits together with everyone. And you can't just look at yourself and say, well, everyone's going to have to figure out how to function around me. Because it doesn't work that way. It's like, how am I going to function with my gifts, with my skill sets, with my abilities, with the way God is working in me that works with everyone else? There's not one person that has it all figured out. And so we need to see ourselves with sober judgment. Sober judgment in a rational vein of thought. And so therefore, that's how we see others. That's how we see ourselves. But also our perspective has to do with how we view others. And how we view others needs to function in love. It's all about love. And people once again, just like that, like I said about the self, no, I'm not that selfish. Yeah, we tend to be that selfish. When it comes to be others, I'm pretty loving. Because we can always identify 2 or 3 or maybe 5 or 6 people that you're like, oh, dude, I've done so many nice things to these people. I'm a loving person. But what about the people that are hard to love? That's a challenge. And that's why he starts out in Romans 12:9. He says, love must be sincere. We're good at saying we're loving people. I would say, I've never done this gauge, so I don't really know, but I would say it's probably in the upper percentages, maybe 80% or more, say they're a loving people. If 80% of the world was a loving person, our world would look a whole lot better than what it does. I'd say it's closer to 8%. Some of you are like, wait a second, that's just rude. We just know how we function. And we choose to love the people that are easy to love, but it's hard to love some people in our world. Raise the hands. No, I'm just kidding. Because you would be the unloving ones right there if you just raise that hand. There are hard people to love. And this is what it says in Romans 12, verse 14. Bless those who persecute you. See, a lot of times our world is convinced that we're being persecuted by everyone right now. The world is out to get me, and I can prove it. And he says, instead of looking at it like that, bless people that you feel are persecuting you. He says, bless and do not curse. See, most of the time, the people that we feel are persecuting us are not even persecuting us. Because once again, that goes back to the fact that we feel it revolves around me. And really, we're like, oh, that was all kinds of wrong. This week, I'll just be honest with you. I'll tell you how bad this guy is up here. This week, I had to make a phone call because we're getting ready to go on Team Mexico. And months ago, because I'm like, oh, okay, we're going on Team Mexico, I filed to renew my passport because it expired while COVID was happening. And I'm like, all right, I got plenty of time. They're like, yeah, it's got plenty of time. Well, this past week, we're a week and a half away from going to Mexico. No passport, all right? I'm that guy. And so it says, well, you can make a phone call in. And so I call the State Department, and I'm like, I need to know where my passport is. What is going on? And instead of being loving and gracious and speaking to this kind, generous woman that answered the phone, I start getting into my bully mode. And I'm like, well, how come my passport's not here? I filed it a long time ago. And like, well, sir, let me check. And of course, you don't want to hear those things. You want to then correct, because doesn't she know that I'm just trying to help people? I'm just trying to go on a mission trip, for crying out loud. But somehow in the midst of this, it became all about me, and I felt persecuted by someone that was just ultimately trying to help me. It was silly. My wife's sitting there going, she sits there at first, and she's like, which I'm glad that she's sitting in the room. And then her eyes start getting really big. And then she starts doing this number. I'm thinking she needed to fan me because I was, she's getting worked up, ready to go. She's like, you need to simmer down, big fella. You need to calm down. And the lady comes back. She goes, let me wait. And I'm thinking, yeah, isn't it good? Sometimes they make you wait, and you're like, you're being an idiot. You know what I mean? Put me on hold so I can realize what an idiot I am. She comes back and she goes, it's coming. Don't worry, it will be there in time. And sure enough, my passport has arrived. But the problem was, I wasn't really as loving as I would like to believe that I am. We all get into that space sometimes. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. There's an activity. There's an intentionality to doing that. It's not just like, well, the people that I don't like, I'm just going to ignore them. Well, that's an act of love, right? Ignoring. At least I'm not lashing out at them. He says, no, actually bless them. Try to seek their good. You're like, but they're doing mean stuff to me. Yeah, but try to seek their good. See, ultimately, love doesn't just choose to bless. Love really shares life. God put us in relationship with one another, and we got to learn to share life with one another. This is what it says in Romans 12:15. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. See, rejoicing's on one end of the spectrum, and we love, oh man, good things are happening. I want to be around people that are positive and happy. But it says mourn with those who mourn. So it's both ends of the spectrum. And we need to learn to grieve with those that grieve. See, sometimes we know those people, they're like, oh, they're always just like Eeyore. Oh, woe is me. I don't want to mourn with you like, oh, I'm sorry, man. I'll be praying for you. None of you ever do that. Sorry, it's just me. We're just like, oh, I'll pray for you as we move our way away from them instead of finding ourselves in that space. But they're going to bring me down. Maybe. Maybe it's okay for us to feel a little bit of the hurt and the pain that they're going through. If people would empathize a little bit more with people in different settings, I think we'd be in a lot better space. But you're like, I don't feel that, so I don't want to feel that. But it's anywhere along the way. He says, just find yourself in space with people. But the problem is, we're too busy, right? We're all too busy. I got things to do. I got people to see. I got places to go. The crazy thing is, Jesus was never too busy when someone was there waiting for him. It always says that he was on his way there. Oh, all of a sudden someone came, and he spent his time with them. It says one time he was cruising along, a whole mass of people, and a woman just touched his cloak, and he said, whoa, stop. Someone just touched me. And they're like, come on, wacky. Everyone's touching you. This is a lot of people around here. And he goes, no, there's someone I got to connect with right now. Are we so busy that we forget the people that are around us? That's unloving. Just going to spell it the way it is, the way it's spelled out in the word here. But love chooses to bless. Love really shares life, and love initiates peace. Love initiates peace. This is what it says in Romans 12:18. If it is possible. I mean, even writes it with a qualifier. But just the qualifier, because it might not be possible, doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility here. He says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Live at peace. Who are the people you don't have peace with right now? And you say, but they've rejected my initiation attempts. He doesn't say just give one attempt. He says, as far as it depends upon you. See, sometimes, at one point where it talks about forgiveness, one of the disciples is like, man, how many times I got to forgive these people? And he says, keep doing it. Same thing with peace. How many times do I got to initiate peace with these people that are just going to reject peace? As far as it depends on you. You might not get to that space of peace, but are you doing your job? See, this world is tragically conflicted right now. Everyone hates everyone. I mean, that's just the way it is. But are we actively initiating peace? Here's the thing that breaks my heart, is that I believe the church has been part of the problem, not the solution. The Big C church. Part of the problem. We like to point out why we disagree with people. But here's the thing. Can we disagree with people yet still have peace with them? Some people might say no. But I say the Jesus that I see in the Bible disagreed with people, yet people still wanted to be around him. Let people still came to him. And he didn't have to agree with everything that they were doing, everything they were engaged in, but he never chose to throw the first stone, so to speak. I know people today in our world that have chosen not to come to church because they don't like what the church stands for. I'm like, we're not living out Romans 12. As far as it depends on me, live at peace with everyone. Doesn't say live in agreement. There's a difference. Can we live in peace, show love to people that disagree with us? See, some of us are like, oh, now you're talking crazy. Because if they would just listen to my latest post, then I could live at peace with them. That's not loving. It's not loving. See, we need to have a proper view of self if we're going to live right. We need to have a proper view of others if we're going to do the right thing. All of this works together to make sure that this life, this faith, this belief in Jesus actually works. Why is it not working? Because you've made it about what it's not about. It's not about you. It's all about Him. Let's take a moment and pray together. God, we thank you today that you want us to live effective, purpose-filled, victorious lives. But that does not mean that we do what we want to do. Forgive us, God, for thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought. God, I pray that you will just allow us the awareness this week to see all the times that we are putting ourselves first, that we are evaluating choices and everything based on how it's going to affect me. And then quickly allow us to realign our minds and be transformed by your grace and your goodness. God, help us to be more humble. And God, I pray that in every situation and every interaction that we find ourselves this week, that we will behave with love. God, for those that are actively wounding us, help us to find ways to return a blessing instead of a curse. God, for those that are going through different things in life, help us not to try to get out of the situation quicker, but help us to spend a little more time investing in where people are truly at. And God, I pray as well that we will initiate peace. God, all of us get frustrated with where our world's at right now. But we got to accept the fact it's not going to change until some of us love by initiating peace. God, I pray for those that are in this room or listening online that haven't taken that step to believe in you as the Lord and Savior of their life. I pray that today, because you are beckoning, you are drawing us into you, I pray that today they will just say, okay, God, I choose to follow this plan. I choose to lay myself down, to sacrifice myself completely to you. Use me, lead me. By your grace, by your power, by your love. In Jesus' name we pray.